Welcome back to MyFinJourney. Today's guest is Ellza Malok, founder and chairwoman of Blue Monarch Group, a behavioral research and engineering firm that helps organizations understand a simple but powerful truth. Outcomes are constrained by behavior. Elza's work sits at the intersection of psychology, business strategy, organizational performance, and decision making. She helps leaders understand why great strategies often fail, not because the strategy was wrong, but because human behavior required to execute it was misunderstood. Her expertise spans marketing, sales systems, mergers and acquisitions, organizational alignment, and even real estate valuations, where she consistently found the same pattern. Organizations often focus on what people want to do without understanding what actually drives people to act. For the MyFin Journey audience, this episode is about leadership, decision making, behavioral psychology, and how understanding people can become a competitive advantage. Ellza, welcome to MyFinJourney.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Ellza, as we get started, I really want to understand what led you to hone in on behavioral psychology.
So it's a bit of a long journey, and I feel like it's a two-path way. On the professional side, I had always been this creative person, but I'm an immigrant kid, and my mom's like, starving artists aren't cool, Elva. Like, go get a job, you know? And I was always kind of good at math, and I liked the idea of helping in some way, shape, or form. But the corporate world was kind of the area that you lean into in terms of what opportunities the United States had. And so I went into that aspect, and then I stumbled upon kind of that data aspect of how do we translate data into actionable intelligence. And then they found out I speak human as well as nerd. So I moved into that sales and marketing relationship within data, which one would think is a very like two different sides of the brain, but it wasn't for me. And I think for a lot of people, it's not in that aspect. And after doing that, agency side, direct with a brand, even under the private equity scope, I ended up in an organization where we transformed them from really this smaller organization that was trying to evolve and decommoditize the industry into something different, like a communications and performance improvement organization. And after making that transition, I kind of sat there and I'm like, well, why does this work? Like we have this entire industry that exists, but I don't know why it works. We have like these instruments of, hey, if we use this communication language and we send our people to X, Y, and Z resort after they've hit their number, they're gonna try to achieve that number well, which makes sense, but I don't get the psychology of it, especially in a world where we're instant gratification, but someone's got to wait a year and a half for that gratification, that reward, and kind of met with some really interesting feedback off of it, but ultimately not a place that they wanted to go to. And it bothered me a lot that I started investigating my own. And I started reading Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, and that kind of led me into this psychology path. On a personal level, I grew up in an area, I was born in Kosovo and I moved here in the 90s. And in a place that was former Yugoslavia, where the communication message for decades was brothers in arms across all the ethnicities of Yugoslavia. And then after that leader had passed, a conversation around really this propaganda level campaign of telling people that there's another group there's an ethnicity amongst us that is not of value, just dehumanizing, and that being the Albanians in former Yugoslavia, to a point where it led to ethnic cleansing and a massive conflict. I saw how critical language became and how important it is to be careful with the words that we choose in every setting, not just necessarily a corporate one. So I feel like I kind of came full circle because as the more I did research, the more I realized this was the tactic that was used. This is the instrument that was played to get to a point where you start, eliminating massive groups of population because a group of population was no longer deemed livable in that region. And that part is intense for me, but it is important that I got to that stage from a research perspective saying this was an engineered group around it.
Ellza, I feel like you just threw a lot at us and I want to unpack it. I want to start in the middle with the book that you mentioned, Influence. Of all the different books that you've read on psychology, human behavior, etc., Is that the most powerful book, the most transformative that you've read, or would you recommend another one?
Oh, I've got a list and I'm terrible with names, but that one was like the first book I read in terms of being read from a psychologist that was academically trained and then did the research for a very long time to understand that on the corporate life. The one this year, my favorite so far has been Thinking in Bets, which is a great leadership book and a personal development book, I would say. It's by Annie Duke. Uh, so that's kind of sitting on my Kindle, and I keep kind of going back to it and being like, oh, I missed this component. So I could certainly give you a list around it. Robert Greene is also a great author in terms of human behavior and the implications of that. 48 Laws of Power and the Laws of Nature is also a really good one that kind of takes a broader view, not necessarily just a corporate lens.
Very interesting. And also, when you think about these books, when you think about life experiences, at what point did you start to draw parallels with what you were learning and what you had maybe experienced or seen, with respect to the Yugoslavian history?
Um, I started to see it when I got into the tactics that are used, particularly like my personal specialty is a lot more on linguistic programming. A lot of other psychologists take different avenues in terms of it, but because I was a writer for such a long time in a personal capacity, it was the one that leaned the most toward me. And language is just such a critical component. So when you think about rhetoric, that's a common one, that's a common term that the political space especially uses, like we can't use X rhetoric. It's not rhetoric, it's linguistic programming that we're trying to normalize. And that's where I started to see it when I got into that sector of behavioral science around like how we program people and how we use language to program that particular. It sounds very MK Ultra-esque, but it's actually fairly simple to go through it in terms of, you start labeling something, and we see that right in category development when you're in the corporate world, like you want to create a space for something entirely different. So you do an analysis and you say, well, we don't do this, but we don't do this, and we create a new definition for something. That's a form of linguistic programming in terms of it. But I did start to see that the most in terms of how we use language to differentiate and how we can use your language to unite and bring people into a fold.
And from your perspective, Elsa, is this a conscientious effort that people make, or is it just a byproduct of maybe faking it till you make it, maybe an S curve where you double down on different strategies and you continue to double down on the strategies that are growing the fastest? Help me and the listener, maybe somebody who doesn't have a psychology background, help us understand, the value of learning these things versus maybe following different thought leaders that happen to be, the best at what they do. Like the theory versus the actual implication, or
Yeah,
theory
so
versus the actual like action.
part of it is it kind of depends on where the origination point of some of these are. There are some who actually have written books, like entire books on how to grow $100 million company, and they may not realize that they're doing some of these psychological behavior tactics, but they are. They just say, "Hey, this system works," and those are great because you don't have to go deep into the science. It doesn't work for everybody, so sometimes you get mixed reviews on those, best-selling books, etc., because maybe that works for that particular audience in that particular segment, etc. So that's all fine. The beauty about psychology, though, is it goes back down to the human behavior component. It goes back down to the fact that we make decisions on feelings, and as sentient as we think we are, as intelligent as we think we are then going to use data to back up that idea. That's why it's so important. In my world, we do double blinds. I put two groups together to do a research project. I don't let them talk to each other, but they do have to write out at least the biases that they are aware of, maybe not the biases that they are not aware of. And then I try to see what conclusions they come out of it. But in terms of like actually performing it and getting like a strategy distilled down to an organization, for example, the buy-in process, and this is one of the most recent research projects we did, is we know the difference between agreement and alignment, right? The performance component. And mathematically speaking, the difference between those is a company that moves 58% faster and is 72% more profitable compared to just plain agreement, where everyone's just nodding their head and saying, yeah, this strategy is okay. We're going to try to accomplish it on the way through. When you get emotional buy-in in that process, you are 200% more faster in executing that strategy and 400% more profitable. So that's really the difference, is when you make that strategic effort to say, I'm going to distill this in a way that makes the most sense, you're going to have faster alignment and buy-in across the group. And you're going to be probably a lot more profitable because you don't have to guess. You don't have to just kind of shoot things in the dark and say, I hope this creative strategy works.
And from your perspective, when you're talking to leaders, when you're talking to C-suite executives, and maybe in your own experience, right? How often is it that an individual is able to get that clarity? Because oftentimes when you look around, it does feel like people are just faking it till they make it. It does feel like there's a bit of lack of clarity.
I think part of it is you just have to be honest about the fact that maybe you're faking it till you make it. You have a lot of leaders who are presenting a facade, and that lack of authenticity, like people can smell that transparently, and especially at
How,
this day
from
and
a psych,
age.
what is it psychologically that they smell?
There's there's a component, and I think we've also just gotten more intelligent around hearing the buzzwords, hearing the words of we're going to disrupt this industry, or we're going to, take it to the next stage, etc. We have these pattern recognition systems built in our brain that frankly have been around since our survival ages, when we were the prey in many periods. That is something that we've learned, and it's just getting more and more sharper as we continue to evolve as humans. But we kind of see that in many ways. The My best recommendation is, when you're trying something new, to leaders, is just be honest, like, hey, I have actually never done this before, but I have some incredibly competent people in our team, and we're going to use science and we're going to use data to make some assumptions and work our way through to get to this end goal. And I encourage and I want everybody else to follow me in this direction. Like, that level of authenticity is so rare, but in the organizations that I help, it is met with such a warm level of welcome across teams. And it doesn't even have to go down, just the senior leadership team. The more you do that all the way down to the individual contributor, it just becomes exponentially more impactful when you're a contributor to an initiative, as opposed to a system in which you're voluntold. This is how we're going to move forward. And that's kind of the difference around it. I use that voluntold specifically because, we have staff that is paid, obviously, but how you execute something is just almost as important as the decision to execute it.
When you said voluntold, I was thinking that it was more in line with the idea that we're programmed a certain way. And voluntold is like a quote unquote new word that maybe didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it felt like more of a link to the pattern recognition. I want to say, if you're listening to this episode, if you're learning something interesting, please take a second to like this episode, hit the subscribe button, and share it with a friend. Because what Elsa is talking about is a bit different than maybe traditional forms of leadership. Traditional forms of leadership are, hey, there's a challenge, I'm going to project strength, I'm going to be the calm in the chaos. But maybe it's to say, hey, there's a lot of chaos around, let's own that reality, let's still project calm, but let's acknowledge the fact that there is a bit of chaos. Elza, I want you to elaborate on this mentality, but I also want to understand how this all plays out in the age of AI. But you're saying that our intuition is highly developed. We're able to sense, threats. We're able to overcome those threats.
Yeah, I mean, we look at the fact that, let's take Gen Z, for example, who has been earmarked as the antisocial, hyper technologized group, except every single stat, and I'm working on a couple of these environmental design projects, mind you, where malls are coming back because there needs to be a third place for Gen Z and Gen Alpha to engage that is not work or home. That's how drastic of a change this is coming. And I'm a millennial. I was the generation that killed off malls, right? Around it, libraries are coming back, and as an on vogue kind of mentality of like, I need to go somewhere and educate myself and study, etc. So I think this is where I go back to the evolution, we still have this inherent need to be human and to do things that are human, even in a digitalized society around it. I'll tell you right now, personally, I work from home, and then after 5, 6 o'clock, whenever I'm done with my job, I want to go talk to people. I'm also a very social person. The other opposite end of the spectrum, which is other, members of my staff who are very introverted and prefer to re-energize on their own, they intentionally make activities to go interact and engage with people. And that's what I mean by that evolutionary component of us to be able to sense human authenticity and the need for human authenticity to be able to engage with. Otherwise, I mean, what's the difference between us and the AI bots that we're creating?
We try to put people in boxes, right? We talked about just now and alluded to maybe the introvert and the extrovert. The idea that the introvert doesn't want to socialize with anybody is kind of how we would define it. But maybe it's just that they want to socialize with people less than maybe the extrovert. So I really want to understand from your perspective, with that behavioral psychology background, how do you think of these things?
I think part of it, and it's a complex place to play when you're working for, corporate organizations that want a yes or a no around it. So we do things in terms of statistical probability. So in the instant that we're kind of describing, and I have actually a really good example because I do a lot of tech and biopharma support in terms of those industries where, maybe their buyer is super introverted, and that's part of their customer profile documents that we get off the bat. The part that's funny about that is they're like, well, they're never going to go to this event. And I'm like, if it's worth it, they will. Just because, and I love the example that you used around introverts, it's not that they never want to be around people, it's just that they have a finite period of time where their energy can be depleted because that emotional exchange takes a lot out of them, which is why they prefer more self organized places. They're going to be very strategic about how they spend their time. So if you provide enough value, they're going to come to that event. And we see that, right? Like we see places like Comic-Con and all these others that have this mindset of all these groups are so introverted. I'm like, they're going to an event of 60,000 people. There's value something there that they're willing to risk that level of emotional energy. And I've heard this a lot where it's like, oh, well, all those groups of people are super introverted and that's why they have to wear masks. And I'm like, that's actually not true. They're engaging in a form of play that they find highly valuable to them, and that has become their third place. That place of emotional exchange because they find value in it. And we know that because there are shows that are over 50 years old that show up in those events that people go to engage and converse with other people that have it. So there's a place of value. So we don't necessarily do that. We don't put things on introversion, extroversion. We put it around where is the value for this people. And that's where I think from a leadership standpoint, especially as you're leading a group of people, you have to think about what is valuable to them in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish. So if you have the, rising stars that have all these ambitious means, they have a different set of values in terms of how you get them to behave and how you get them to perform at a certain level than potentially the mom that wants to check out at 3 to 5 so that way they can do the 7 to 9 because they have a kid pickup. You know, different behavioral mechanisms and different rewards and incentives for different types of people. And that requires work. That requires you understanding your team. That requires you being empathetic enough to understand the scenario. I'm not a mom, but a good portion of my staff are parents. In 20 minutes, most of them will be out for 2 hours for it. So, and you just kind of have to work with that. But I know the output I'm getting. I know that if I can give them the space, they're less distracted. And, the 7 to 9, they're going to pump out most of the work that they've been kind of holding off on since 3.
I think it's a very profound response, Elsa. And I want to dive a little deeper, even though I feel like you already answered the question I was going to ask. Right? For that leader, right? Like you mentioned your example, that you're not a mom, but you're able to empathize with your employees that are moms. How can a leader effectively empathize with their team if they've never been through that challenge? Right? We touched on the Comic Con example, and you said, no, people are being highly social. And in fact, it's a higher level of play. But if I'm somebody who never watched anime, I never watched cartoons growing up, I can imagine that there would be a disconnect and it would be hard to empathize with somebody if they're in a reality that I've never even heard of or I've never even experienced. When you're in those rooms, when you're having those conversations, how are you able to upskill leaders to be able to best position themselves to lead a team that has a different background than they themselves?
I think for me, I found that metaphorical translations, as I kind of like to call it, have always played well in terms of working that through. So if I have to talk to a leader, and I should preface that any leader, the term leader is not follow me, I command you. The term leader is you've got a bunch of followers that believe in you and have awarded you the title of leader. It is a service-based role. And if you think otherwise, it may be time for you to do some introspection as to that. But to be able to serve is to be able to empathize, in my opinion. Because I am not the Comic-Con going type of person, but a vast majority of my analysts are. They fit that demographic, and that's how I actually know a lot about it. And prior. So for me to be able to say, well, what do I like? What am I excited about? I'm excited about X, Y, and Z. I'm a big gardener, right? So that's my equivalent. Like I get super excited when I have to go to the farmer's market and I see new plants and new vegetables that maybe I haven't been exposed to, but other communities have brought in. I think about that level of excitement and then I just say, well, that's their excitement. I don't think you have to like do mental gymnastics to empathize with somebody. I think you just have to be open to the fact that these are people and they have differences just like your friends, just like your colleagues that you're super close to. And that's every manager, that's every CEO, that's every person who's held a C-suite that has people reporting under them. You do have to sit there and say, okay, well, what am I excited about? And then translate not the context, but the level of excitement into that. And then you go and ask questions. You be curious and say, well, tell me what is exciting, because what's exciting for one person maybe not be exciting or invoking a particular emotional response in another way. So in my opinion, it's that service-based, curious first type of mindset in order for you to be a really good leader. And I think often sometimes like, well, I just need to get to X. But point A to point B may be a lot farther or go a lot slower if you don't understand what is powering that engine. And that engine is the team that's working on these things. And I talk about, and especially in terms of emotional buy-in, alignment is when you get everybody going in the same direction, right? Emotional buy-in is when you put a jetpack on each of them, filled with fuel, and be like, go. And it takes that service-based mindset to make sure that every single person has the jetpack for you. You have to supply that. It's not self-supplied.
I appreciate that also. It's a very interesting response. I appreciate the metaphors, and it felt like the answer was underpinned on the fact that being a leader is a service-based position, that you're empowered to be a leader. And I want to understand your thoughts on, the corporate America structure, a structure that is sometimes referred to as rigid, a structure where I can imagine most people aren't promoted not because of self-service, because they're giving to others, but because they're the best one at their current role. So then the assumption is that they'll be the best leader. And to me, as you described this, to me, as I experienced corporate America earlier in my career, it feels like that can create a lot of maybe weakness at the foundational level that stops a company from continuing to scale. I want to understand from your perspective, from behavioral psychology, from what you've seen professionally, is that does that actually play out in corporate America? Is it just that, my anecdotal experience is not representative of a larger theme?
I think, and I go back to like, I don't necessarily want to generalize all organizations, but I do think
Sure.
that for the most part, they fall into two major categories and how sometimes they intersect and sometimes that, it's a bit more of a Venn diagram. And there are some that are very much in the rigidity spectrum. And we see this in many roles, especially in my instance where we work with a lot of sales and marketing teams. And the top salesperson becomes now the marketing manager, which is a total setup for failure because not only do they keep the quota they have, but then they have people under them and they've never managed people under them. And then, a year and a half later, we realize that the quota wasn't meant for the people under them or the top performer. I think that's part of the fact that sometimes leadership assigns other leadership, and I go back to the definition of a leader, is you already have followers. You already have trust in a group of people. And we see this often in our world, and perhaps you've seen it in yours, where you have that one person that like everyone relies on, maybe in a department, like, oh, hey, I need help. I'm going to go ask Joe because he probably can, help me figure this out. Joe is the leader, but often somebody else gets promoted to that official title. But for all intents and purposes, even if that other person gets promoted, they're not going to go to the other person. They're going to go to Joe because Joe has built trust amongst the followers that he's curated. That's
And
the
how does that
difference.
play out, Elsa? Like when that happens, when that promotion plays out, and that promoted person now goes to Joe because that promoted person is not as good as Joe. How does that play out versus, hey, I can't promote Joe because that'll create a vacuum in this leadership kind of position of a subject matter expert. So Joe needs to stay in his position. Somebody else needs to lead the team.
I think what does tend to happen is the person who got promoted and the Joes of the world, the leader by performance versus the leader by title, there tends to be an us versus them mindset between the two. And very rarely will the person who got the title actually go to the leader in terms of earned trust to ask for aid, because it creates that dynamic. It takes a very specific type of personality to overcome that. The really good ones will then, extend a hand to the leader that's been built by trust, like the Joes of the world, to say, hey, I'm new in this role and I know that you're a subject matter expert, etc. And then you bring them into the fold. And ideally, if you're really smart, you create a really good career path for them so they stay. But in many instances, they become, like on paper, they become the champion of a particular initiative, etc. It's a lot of more corporate language than actual indifference. And I'm sure you've seen it where it's like, there's the eye rolling of, we've hired X, Y, and Z, and so is now the ambassador of this initiative, and push comes to shove, everybody just goes back to their, original plays. There's ways to fix that for sure. As I described, like you have the person that's a leader in title, and then you have the person that's a leader in trust from a trust-based perspective, and those two work together and drive it, because perhaps that leader in title has different acumen that was very valuable. There's plenty of reasons why that occurs. It just becomes yet another hurdle for someone to go to, instead of bringing the person that already had earned that trust. All the other skills, in my opinion, can be very much taught pretty easily. Teaching people how to build trust is a really hard skill to have. It's why sales is such a hard role to have. So if someone can do it inherently, leverage it. Use it, train all the other aspects, the technical skills, the hard skills, etc. Because that is one that, even from a behavioral perspective, we do a lot of empathetic training, trust building training for teams. It takes a long time for you to build that naturally.
So I want to zoom in here. I want to understand, Elsa, from your perspective. You just said, correct me if I'm wrong, you just said the skill of learning how to build trust is very difficult. I've seen resumes before. I assume you've seen resumes before. I've never seen a skill set of builds trust easily or builds trust, maybe builds bridges, maybe team player, definitely. So help me understand from your perspective, maybe what is the difference between being able to build trust and being a team player? What is your, like, what fundamentally what I'm asking is, why do you view it such a hard skill for people?
I think part of it is, when you can build trust, not only do you come into a conversation from a place of understanding, and we've seen this, right? Like the people who, for better or for worse, interview very well, like that technical term of, I interview very well. It's because they know how to quickly connect with someone and then move down the path. Sometimes it's by particular audience. Like there are some that interview or connect really well with senior leaders, but not the rest of their team. It's not that they're terrible at the rest of their team. It's just they prioritize where they use that skill set, whether they're conscious about it or not. And I think that's the difference. The difference between, in my opinion, team player is someone who can work through the team instead of working with the team, and understanding, all right, well, so-and-so is really good at X and so-and-so is really good at Y. I got to get them to work together and I'm going to work with them to make sure that they build that memory, that muscle memory of how to work together. Whereas in many instances, a team player will, assign them and then give milestones of, hey, you guys need to get through X, Y, and Z. And then if there's conflict, they often have certain policies in place. They have to rely on policies instead of trust to kind of work through those. And in many instances, it just becomes messy. Whereas the person who can build trust will like work through to build that trust amongst other people as well, because they'll leverage their reputation of how they've built trust and then connect two people together. That's kind of the bigger difference. It's really hard to find that on a resume. You've got to meet them in person. But if you already have a team member that, has built in that trust, it makes very little sense for you to go find somebody else to be a leader if they've got that baked in.
That makes so Elza, it feels like when you look at the 48 laws of power, it feels like the storyline is maybe that people are more selfish and you just have to play to their strength. You can't outperform the person above you. You kind of need to position your success as their success. And it feels like the other book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is maybe from more of an empathetic lens of really trying to understand where people are at and understand how to communicate with them and understand their desires and really help optimize for their desires. From your perspective, what have you seen maybe play out more strategically, or is it different depending on the person themselves?
So I find the 48 laws of power a more, while it can be cynical in view, still a pretty more realistic view of the masses as a whole, partly because the corporate world rewards that behavior.
Okay.
Whereas other books that talk about the empathetic component, I personally take more of the empathetic approach. That is baked into my DNA. I've kind of always been that person. But there are other people who have a particular aim and they read this book and then they see that that's all for them. Unfortunately, for the most part, a lot of the world gets rewarded in that system. So it is very factual in nature around understanding and getting a clear view of the players and where power lies and how to influence, etc. The difference is how you wield it. And if you personally make that choice to wield it in a particular way, it's fine, but you should also kind of be aware of how others are wielding that type of power. So I see it more as a like, because it does have a ton of evidence around the how it works. And we don't have to look any farther than society to see that, right? We don't have to look at the corporate world. We can just look at the overall statistics across the globe around that reward system that the 48 laws of power show. But there are people who are like, yes, that's true. And if you change the incentives, we can then also change the behavior. And I'm a big proponent of it's where the incentive lies. So if a corporate structure is super rigid and they only promote the people that can play the game, then that's the corporate structure's instance, and you can choose to stay and play, or you could choose to find an organization that doesn't. Today, that's kind of hard to do given the economic environment that the United States particularly is. So you kind of work through what you can. But I do think that the 48 Laws of Power is a more realistic view of the things that we reward, especially in the corporate setting.
I feel it was very informative, balanced, deep response. So I do appreciate that. But ultimately, I think it comes down to how do we use all of this conversation to actually create a competitive advantage? You touched on the fact that people make purchasing decisions emotionally and justify it logically. It's something that as a salesperson you hear a lot, and most salespeople probably agree with that. But there's that one salesperson who's like, oh, I really don't like this stat. I really don't like this framing. I really don't like this potential reality. How does that salesperson, and it could be the same for 48 Laws of Power versus slash and, how to win friends and influence people. How does that person use all of this information, use their gut, use their instincts to actually take all of this data and drive more growth?
Yeah, so I think that for the conversation of growth in terms of I would like to leverage the behavioral aspect, but I don't necessarily like the existing reality of how people buy. Because we've all been in RFP situations where we know that the questions were asked, we lean toward, and then all of a sudden you realize it's a token bid because it's going to go back to the same person X, Y, and Z around it. That's where I say it depends on how you wield it. So if you choose, and in that instance, if I know that this is a token bid, I'm not going to bother and waste my time and my effort on a bid that I'm never going to get. What I am going to do is I'm going to probably spend the better part of a year, if I really want that account, for example, to get in and build that connection differently. So that way the next time around, it's not a token bid. And that all depends on how I want to spend my time. I know amazing salespeople that understand books like the 48 Laws of Power as a place of here's how decisions are subconsciously made, and then choose to use that in terms of, well, I'm going to sell from a place of happiness and positivity. One of the most amazing salespeople I know does that, and she's a top performer consistently because she says, look, I get this is how you're probably going. And she even calls it out. She's like, statistically speaking, you're probably going to choose X company because you've been working with them for the last 5 years. And the incumbent is always easier to choose because you've already seen it. However, if you give us a chance because of X, Y, and Z, there's really good ways to kind of cut through that noise, but you have to find your point of authenticity and then find a joining message and narrative that you want to tell. In my way, I have a very particular way of, I'm sure that you see X, Y, and Z. You probably see it because of A, B, and C. And here's the statistical analysis around it. And sometimes that kind of gives people a little bit of a wake-up call. Not all the time, but the majority of the time where it feels comfortable for me to continue doing that because it gives me the result I'm looking for. So I think that's part of it is like going back to authenticity of find where you stand. You don't have to listen to all the 40 laws of power, but you can call it out or you can use it in a different way and then help you prioritize. Do you want to spend your time here? And maybe you're the type of person who's like, I really hate all of this. There are amazing nonprofits that look for salespeople and development funds, etc. So you don't necessarily have to stay in the industry to play that.
Very interesting conversation because now we're really zeroing on sales and marketing without really talking about sales and marketing too much, in my opinion. From your perspective, right? Because you mentioned yourself, you mentioned a colleague of yours who you admire and respect, and I'll throw myself in the hat in the ring to say that's how I sell. But from you and for me, it's just kind of personality and preference. But for you, I feel like there's a lot of data behind it. Like, why would you call out the subconscious things people are probably thinking? For me, it's anecdotal. Like, hey, people are worried about lack of cash flow. These are the right strategies. You might be making more than 250K plus, but you're still living paycheck to paycheck because those are kind of the data. But I'm not even saying it from a data perspective. I'm saying it from experiences because I talk to people about money. For you, when you look at it and when you sit down and break down the psychology of a buying decision, which I individually find immensely valuable, what is the data saying? Like, why are you doing it?
So it depends on the audience. And this is one of the things that we do in our workshops where we say, somebody who buys for this product and somebody who buys that product, from a psychological perspective, is relatively the same. However, how they interpret that information within your brand could be drastically different than how they interpret it from another. And that's why somebody else's conversion rates are higher than yours. Their close rates are higher than yours. And that doesn't matter if it's B2B, it doesn't matter if it's consumer, it doesn't matter if it's partnership alignment, whatever. That all comes from the same place, but it's the interpretation. So it's kind of like you saying, well, if I know that my exponent is 5, I'm going to make up a random number. Whatever 5 is multiplied by impacts the result of that multiplication, right? So if it's the combination of inputs that are important for us to understand, because the behavior is the behavior is the behavior. But we're not silos. We're not, these rigid forms. We absorb things constantly. And those micro changes can shift us in very specific ways. So it's important for us to break down. And part of the workshop is like is an empathetic perspective. Like, I am the salesperson, you are the customer. You're you're going to give me everything I'm supposed to throw at you, but you're going to pretend you're this person and you've got 20 minutes with this call. What are you going to throw at me? Or what should I be throwing at you? And then you're going to tell me how you feel at every time I throw this piece of information at you within that lens. So it's a little bit of that workshop of understanding how things play out around it, because again, we're not these shut, sealed creatures that nothing gets through. We absorb things, and how we react to them is a psychology, but how we, what we're absorbing is also a portion of it. And dynamics are really, really fun. Personally, as someone who likes to geek out, I'm like, oh, so if I like pull this lever and,
The A/B
within
testing of humans.
not necessarily even the A/B testing of humans, like, oh, did you realize that if we change this one word, the perception, it's like tone, right? And you've seen that new TikTok, Instagram trend where someone's reading the same thing in 4 different tones. That's kind of like, how people interpret information in the corporate world, especially via email. It's hilarious to kind of see, because we get a ton of email data around like, well, so-and-so said this. And I'm like, okay, but how did you read it? Like, read it out loud, how you read it. And then the other person read out loud how you typed it. Because tonality is so important.
I love that. I love that. So pivoting a little bit, from your perspective, when you look at life, do you just feel like it's a bunch of different sales and marketing interactions where we're all being consistently pitched different things? Or do you look at life a bit differently?
I think of human interaction as a cyclical component. Like there's a cycle to convincing someone or getting someone in that emotional buy-in. It is a sales skill that's used. But I think as humans, we have this immense potential to do anything we want. Like, we are literally the most dominant animal on the planet. We can create shape society however you want. We can shape corporate world however we want. We just all have to collectively choose to do so. And I like to think that the tiny, tiny bit of impact that I make ripples across. And then there are other people who have this similar mindset that are also creating their own ripples. And we get to, at some point in probably not our lifetime, but maybe in the future, where there is a little bit more of an equilibrium of the quality of life in terms of the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of purpose that we find. But I like to think of it as, this is a component of life. It's not all of my components of life. And it's an area that I just want to make more people aware of, because then they can take it and apply it elsewhere. Who do I love helping and who I help probably the most in terms of it kind of depends. So I would say at the end of the day, we help individual performers, individual contributors in corporate environments, because they get to see a change in their leader and are able to kind of have a say in the direction around. I think those are the people that we make the most impact on in a positive way. The reward system. So why don't we just reward the benefit of all as opposed to the benefit of a few?
So ultimately, if somebody's listening to this and it really resonates and they're trying to grow themselves and they don't necessarily know the right direction to grow in, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Me personally, LinkedIn is going to be the easiest way to get a hold of me. If you're looking into making more changes, we've got a ton of resources on our website, or you can reach to one of us on our site and book time with us directly to say, hey, I've got this particular growth avenue or leadership development or strategic implementation that we're working through, and we'll get you the information. At the very least, we'll get you the information you need, and then talk a little bit more about how we could potentially help. But those are probably the easiest ways to get a hold of myself as well as the rest of the organization.
Awesome. I love the conversation because it reminds us that strategy alone isn't enough. At the end of the day, businesses don't execute, people do. And the better we understand how people think, respond, adapt, and make decisions, the better equipped we are to build organizations that perform consistently. We mentioned we'll link all of those links in the show notes. That way people can access them and reach out to you. If you have been listening to this episode and you found value, please do hit the like button, the subscribe button, but most importantly, share it with a friend, or a leader. They might be a leader but not have the title. And hopefully, this conversation helps them bridge that gap and ultimately get the promotion they're looking for. We'll see you in the next episode of MyFinJourney. Until then, bye, guys.